Yannicka, I think we have a packed agenda and so forth. So
Yes, take it away.
All right, we have everybody and everybody's joined us. So thank you very much to everybody for joining. On behalf of Judy Yu, Chair of the ATIS Committee and with Associated Engineering, I'm Omar Chowdhury. I'm Project Lead with the City of Ottawa. And you know, we're excited to have what was part 2 of our series on accessibility, looking at the design and implementation of systems that all of us manage. You know, accessibility is one component of the things that we do, but it's actually a very important pillar and very important component for us, and certainly as us as a municipality, to ensure that the environment that we're creating is inclusive and equitable for everybody, so that they can participate in our society, have the mobility to get around, and to be able to do so at the same sort of level of convenience as those of us who don't have any of those challenges. And so today we have Kara Wilkie and Yuval Grinspoon from Left Turn, Right Turn, and then Oscar Weston from Digital, TELUS Digital. I knew I was going to mess up the two and put the one in front. And so I'd like to just turn it over to you guys to get started. We have a packed agenda. I think February 23rd was the first event that we have, and for those who are members of ITS Canada, you can, I think, find the recording available online in the members section. And then we'll be able to, I think Kara and Yuval will be able to talk a little bit about the last version or last session and continue on. So take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks for that introduction, Omar, and nice to see people still trickling in. Good attendance here. As mentioned, this is part 2 of 2. Kara, we're seeing the share screen. There we go. Great. And so this part 2 of 2 is we entitled "So Your Systems Aren't Accessible, How Do You Fix It?" is actually it's following up from the last session. If you go to the next slide, the last session was more around your systems might be accessible, but they're probably not. Really, it was us talking through and working through, helping people understand, you know, that accessibility is a journey, and that, you know, if you're not explicitly trying to think about accessibility in the work that you're doing, your systems are not going to be accessible. And even if you are thinking about it, there's probably still going to be gaps. I'm excited to be joined by 2 of my colleagues from LTRT. I'll introduce them in a second. But in terms of the agenda itself, for today, what we want to do is we're going to do a quick recap, very quick recap of some of the key themes and topics from last time, specifically around designing for accessibility and accessibility standards, before shifting into how to consider accessibility across the technology lifecycle. And really, it's one of those things that we do in our work, promote and work with agencies and organizations, is, you know, depending on where you are in your technology lifecycle, whether it be planning, procurement, implementing, or operating, there are things that you should be doing and could be doing to improve on your systems. So very briefly, who we are. I'm joined, as I mentioned, by Oscar and Kara. Oscar Weston is a digital accessibility leader and advocate. He enables organizations to meet their goals of providing accessible products and services. Oscar provides recommendations to corporate clients and offers a unique approach to digital accessibility, focusing on user experience over legislation and requirements. His community-focused speaking engagements include conferences, leadership forums, and lectures at a local college. Oscar also created a customer-first curriculum for the accessibility course for a global leader in workforce transformation and digital skills training. Oscar does work with TELUS Digital, but also works as a senior consultant on the digital accessibility side with Left Turn, Right Turn. And the other key speaker here today is Kara Wilkie. She's principal of LTRT's accessibility practice. Kara is a seasoned disability rights advisor and policy analyst with experience engaging with the disability community and organizations seeking to improve their accessibility. A consultant and legal counsel with over 19 years of experience understanding legal obligations and various options for compliance, Kara has advised multiple transportation agencies, governments, quasi-governmental, and private organizations regarding their accessibility legal obligations, including the Accessible Canada Act, the AODA, or Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act, and human rights legislation. She works with those organizations to understand why accessibility is important and to chart a path to a more accessible future. And Kara leads our accessibility practice at LTRT. I'm Yuval Grinspan. I am the principal of LTRT's transportation practice. And I've been in the transportation sector since 2002. I started my career at IBI Group and worked on a variety of ITS initiatives there. In 2014, I left IBI and joined the TTC as an embedded contractor and worked firsthand within a transportation agency to deliver large-scale technology transformation programs. And then in 2018, left TTC to focus on growing LTRT to the organization that we are now. So who are we? We are a boutique transportation and accessibility consulting firm. We were incorporated in 2014. We have a team of 16 full-time and another 20 to 25 affiliates that we work with who are dedicated to transportation and accessibility projects and accessibility initiatives. And we all bring a combination of in-house as well as consulting experience. We've worked on a substantial number of projects and with a substantial number of clients across the country. You can see on this slide here just a sampling of those. And with that, what we'll do is we'll get into the first part of our recap, and I'll hand it over to Kara to tell you a little bit more about designing for accessibility. Take it away, Kara.
Yeah, thanks, Yuval. And I'm going to invite you and Oscar to jump in and be conversational as we go. But this is my section, my slides, but I'm happy for you both to chat as we're going. So we just wanted to talk about, sorry, I'm also recovering from something, and so may cough. So we just wanted to come back just really quickly and talk about some of the things that we talked about previously, in case you didn't miss it or you missed it or it was 5 weeks ago and you've completely forgotten about it. So first off, just to talk about that when we're talking about disability, we're talking about things that are permanent or temporary, but there are also going to be situational elements to accessibility and the barriers that people experience. And that those things can be we're grouping them here across 5 domains, but there are many different ways of grouping them. So that being seeing, speaking, thinking, touching, and hearing. And so I don't want to go through this in detail, but some of those examples might be, so for a permanent disability around sight might be somebody who's blind, whereas something that's temporary around speak could be laryngitis. We're here, if you're familiar with Yuval's voice, you can hear that right now in there. And so if he was really struggling with his voice, but things that might impact all of us in a situational aspect for thinking would be if you're under stress. And how that really affects the clarity of thought. I know for me in particular, when I'm trying to get through a to-do list leading up to my vacations, my thought is much less clear than it is when I've got ample time. And so just to really kind of put that into context is the broad array of both disabilities, but also other life experiences or situations that impact how we experience technology and the barriers that we experience in the world. So last time we did talk about various examples of kind of transit or transportation technology. Here we've got an image of a pay parking system that you could use in a parking lot. And we walked through some of the barriers that might have been in that, including things about its height for somebody of either short stature or somebody using a wheelchair. There would not being any braille, potentially the complexity of that. The operating controls might have had some challenges around the dexterity that might have been required around those. The print, the size of the print on that screen, how much contrast there is between the black text on a gray background. I know I have struggled to read those when it's bright and sunny outside, and let alone when so that's being kind of those situational challenges that we're talking about, but those pieces of contrast also having other challenges. We also really briefly talked about, and we're not going to go into kind of the details of what these are, but that there are a large number of international standards that are available. And I'd say for many of our clients, these are useful particularly we'll come back to them around procurement, but around defining what are those really specific benchmarks of accessibility. Oscar will talk about them as not being the be all and end all, but they can be a useful reference, a useful kind of shorthand and things that people are knowledgeable about or should be knowledgeable about if they're working in digital accessibility. And so this being WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are international guidelines mostly intended for websites, so they have some applicability to other areas based off of the POUR principle, so perceivable, operable, usable, and robust. And there's a lot of specific guidelines within those. And then there's two others that are international guidelines that honestly are getting used a fair bit outside of that. So the Section 508 standards in the US are applicable to federal agencies or federally funded agencies and have standards on accessibility. They're built off of WCAG, but have an application outside of websites into other pieces of technology. And similarly, there's standards in the EU, which are the EN 301-549 standard, which also set requirements for procurements and public products in the EU. Again, very similar to the Section 508 standards, built off of WCAG and incorporating WCAG, but having broader application than just of websites. And to bring these things into Canada, we don't have explicit standards at this point in time, though we do in Ontario. The AODA has reference to WCAG. Similarly, the Manitoba standards have recently come into place with reference to WCAG. The Accessible Canada Act is currently developing the standards in development to adopt these EU standards. So they're all kind of built off of the same framework, and so it's useful to have knowledge about what those international standards are. So Oscar is going to tell you kind of what the limitations of those are and some other pieces around how to use them or think about.
I like that you introduced the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, pretty thoroughly here. I want to share that it is a great resource and it will help you make a product more accessible, but it certainly can't guarantee that you're going to build an accessible product. The current version of WCAG is 2.1. Level A is the most minimum thing you can possibly do to be accessible, and it's not nearly good enough. Level AA is I guess a goal that you should always be trying to meet, and then there is a AAA version of WCAG that kind of says if you really want to go above and beyond, and if your technology is able to do so, then you should meet the AAA guidelines. Targeting AA is good. Targeting what's currently available in 2.1 is also good. Looking forward to the fact that WCAG is always evolving and thinking of 2.2 and ultimately 3.0, which will change completely how WCAG is presented. That's really the objective. Use WCAG as a tool. It's definitely going to help. It's going to change. If you're trying to be better than the current requirement, which is often just WCAG 2.1 level AA, you're going to create a robust product that's more future friendly. And in that POUR analogy that goes with WCAG, the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Robust is your goal. Obviously, you want to make things that are helpful to your customers, but if you're building it in a way that you're trying to be more compatible and flexible of changes, then you're going to be able to grow. Your product will grow, and you won't be stuck in a position where you meet all these guidelines, and then you can't go further. On this screen, we're also introducing something that's known as the functional accessibility requirements, and it's a more user-focused way to consider accessibility. It does exist as documentation. There's a lot of different frameworks. The link in this presentation links off to a framework that helps you kind of use it and review it. Unlike WCAG, it does kind of offer a bit more of a gray area and understanding of the nature of humans. Humans aren't easily narrowed down to a checklist. So when you think about or understand at least what these functional accessibility requirements are, you're able to build a better product. And we're going to look at that a bit on the next slide as well.
Yeah, I might just add to that, Oscar. We know that WCAG 2.2 is scheduled to come out in May. So if you're thinking about this down the road, 2.2 is the one to be referencing, and some of those changes are to remove one element that, or what some of the proposed standard. We don't know finally what the draft was, to remove something that's no longer a direct applicability because of the changes in technology, to add some things, particularly around kind of password resets and some things around accounts, and then to clarify a few things. So it's not a major overhaul. Most of it is very similar, but to keep that fresh and updated as technology evolves and our use of technology has evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that's currently really positive, a positive direction that WCAG 2.2 is going to change is the way that you measure color contrast. And a lot of people want to move forward on how to do that right away, but the thing is, you shouldn't be doing all of those things right away because they are changing. So some things you can look forward to. There's other things like the color contrast algorithms that you shouldn't be trying to meet those kinds of things now. In any case, on screen right now, we're showing you something that combines accessible user experiences and those functional accessibility requirements. It's a way of thinking about the users first. It's a good place to kind of think about accessibility if you're just starting out. WCAG itself is very detailed and very useful and helpful if you know how to navigate that space. But understanding the customers that you're building for through a limited 6 experiences is a nice way to just think about things from that perspective. So we've got the 6 experiences that kind of focus on starting with simple things like content and context and how to use something and how the product structure flows, the content structure flows. And then we look at things like screen magnification and text resizing if you're building a product that can scale, and because that can help a lot of people with low vision. And basically, we're moving on the way down towards the more complex tools like screen readers and other assistive technologies. And along that way, you can kind of align a lot of the functional accessible requirements. For example, if we look at color contrast and color blindness, the cues that you're using in that space can help, obviously help people who are looking at things, but it also might make it a little easier to remember and memorize things if it's easy to understand and it registers quickly. So a combination of accessible user experiences and functional accessibility requirements, and an understanding of that will let you define considerations or success criteria that as they apply for your product. Most of these experiences apply to every product, but of course there's certain things that might not matter. If you're not using any animations or motion-based communication, then the 5th principle here isn't necessarily something that you need to be concerned about in your product. But of course, if you do use these kind of things, then you should be considering it.
The functional accessibility requirements in a report or recommendations from the Standards Development Committee for the AOGA regulations a few years ago was recommending the adoption of moving from WCAG over to functional accessibility requirements. So they're not currently adopted directly into those laws, but they are recommended and are certainly the more accessible approach.
Yeah, certainly. It's good to consider the customers. That's really a better way, at least, to understand how to make your product more accessible.
Yeah, and I think it's often useful to just think about, a lot of accessibility is about flexibility for somebody who's using it to be able to choose how they want to be able to engage with that technology or how it best meets their needs. And I think often a good example that people don't necessarily think about is around magnification and text size, is that for some people with seeing or vision disabilities, they want things to be really giant fonts so that they can see them more clearly. But for other people, if you've got very limited pinhole vision, you actually need it a very small font so that you can see as much content as possible and make it actually make sense in that small limited vision. And so there isn't one or the other that actually meets people's accessibility needs. It's about the flexibility for a user to be able to adapt that to their specific needs.
Yeah, definitely. And contrast themes are similar. As if someone's able to change the way that they view the entire product, if it's on their on a website or a product that they're using on their own personal machine, they can customize it to a way that works for them. And as long as you're aware of that, not everybody's going to consume the content the way that you provide it, and you're building it in a robust, flexible way, then you're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a bit about where we consider accessibility across a product life cycle. So I'll leave it to Oscar.
Yes, so a lot of the times what ends up happening is we don't think about accessibility up front, and we end up considering accessibility towards the end of our product life cycle. And in this case, we have the 4 stages of planning, procurement, implementation, and operations. If you haven't been thinking about accessibility up to this point, you might not realize it until you hear from people like us and we talk to you, or somebody registers a complaint against your product. And at that point, you're kind of at a position where it's a lot more difficult to have to go back to the drawing board and realize how you're going to fix things. But of course, if you do consider accessibility throughout your product lifecycle, from planning and procurement and implementation and operations, then you're going to save yourself a lot of time and a lot of money. And while it's not easy to get everything 100% perfect right away, it is easy to at least think about what you're trying to do, being aware of it by using those functional accessibility requirements or the accessible user experiences, or becoming familiar with something like WCAG or the other types of guidelines that are available to you. So that way, at least you can identify what you need to do and might need to make better, rather than being stuck at the end with a product that may not have considered any of those accessibility requirements.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
accidentally creating those barriers. I've often talked to
Yeah.
clients about you might still end up implementing something that has some barriers or challenges within it, but you've done it deliberately and knowingly, which we'll talk a bit further down the road about, but rather than just discovering down the road. You've all sounded like you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of research coming out around the business case as well, around designing for accessibility and planning, and sort of bringing these in the early investment into the planning and procurement stages in particular pays off in terms of making products or systems that have higher utility, higher use, and are just more used more by the intended audience, right? So the business case is pretty strong on that. I think, to Oscar's point, it's always a lot harder to try to remedy something at the end after you've implemented it, or late in the implementation stage when you get a complaint. But having it captured early and documented early, and as we'll talk about here, is sort of the way to go.
Well, and as we were talking about with the kind of situational effects of accessibility earlier on, there's a lot of overlap between general user experience and accessible user experience, and that accessible user experience will improve the experience for users that might not think about it from an accessibility perspective. So, examples of my Sunshine example with the one piece of software or technology that we were talking about, but also whether it's, or you're, on a loud subway, or, other pieces where people are using technology.
Yeah, for sure.
So Oscar, I think you're going to keep talking about planning for accessibility as the first step in that kind of 4-step process.
Definitely, yeah. And what we're going to look at here is try to at least understand where you are. So if you're not sure exactly where to start for accessibility, think about whether or not you have any tools and standards written down for accessibility, or if you're familiar with some. Are you doing any kind of training? Perhaps you're just doing some, base level training to help your team and staff understand how to consider disability and speak to people with disabilities. And AODA requires a lot of that kind of training to be taken care of in many businesses. So know what you have first, and then identify those things, and write them down. It's all about keeping track of things here. And if you're continuously working on you're improving your tools and standards and providing better training and support, share that information and let people know that you're doing good work and that you are considering accessibility as you go. It's valuable. Like, celebrate your team members if they're doing good work as well. Like, definitely give credit to people who are trying to build an accessible product. It's not always an easy thing to do, but if someone's trying to do it, definitely don't ask them not to. That happens quite a lot in accessibility. Sorry, you have to prioritize something else. Try to help them to be successful. So those are good things to consider. Now, we're looking at the maturity model as a way of kind of figuring out where you are. So that's subjective in a lot of ways, but what we have on screen right now just is an example of some way that you could apply general terms to your industry or to your product and determine where you are and where you're trying to go. Having a plan like this and making this kind of commitment will go a long way when you if you face barriers or you discover barriers or your customers discover barriers. Being able to say that, yep, we have a plan in place and we're really trying to move forward is a good way to reduce, I guess, it mitigates your risks, if nothing else. Like if you know you have a gap, if you know you're trying to get to be better, it's a positive thing.
Yeah, so we're going to move on to talking about procuring for accessibility. And honestly, this is going to be the bulk of the section that we talk about. And we're going to talk about procuring for accessibility across that procurement process. So in product research, in defining your requirements, and including those in your solicitation documents, evaluating proposals and VPATs, which is an acronym I'll introduce in a second, through contract negotiation and testing and validation. So the product research, honestly, this is going to be very similar to product research you're probably doing for lots of procurements beforehand, is knowing what's on the market, but not just asking the questions about how those meet your business requirements, but also finding out what they do around accessibility. And so suggesting that you want to engage with vendors directly to see how they're considering accessibility. Many vendors, particularly those that are active in the US or in the EU, because of those requirements that exist there, will have documents already prepared about the accessibility of their products. For many of those, you can actually find them online. They're publicly available. And so those are VPATs, voluntary product accessibility templates. They're also called accessibility conformance reports. One of those is what it's called when it's not complete, and the other is what it's called when it is complete, but you'll find the language for either. And then talking to your peers about what they're doing. So, talk to, if that's another jurisdiction in Canada, or you want to talk to a US peer, what are they doing? What kind of feedback have they received from products that they're using or systems that they're using? And what has their experience been working with a vendor to find out about the accessibility and to fix problems when they do come up? We want to talk a bit about defining your requirements through that procurement process. And so one of those would be figuring out what are your current legal requirements and what might be some upcoming legal requirements. So I talked a bit about this at the beginning, but for example, in the federal space across Canada, there is currently a good requirement for government websites, so not all applications, but in technology, but for government websites to be WCAG compliant. They're also in the midst of developing procurement standards on procuring, not just technology, but procurements more broadly. And as I said, they're working to adopt that EU standards. There's a current standards development committee that is working to develop to see how much they can just directly adopt the EU standard for accessibility. Similarly, in Ontario, we have requirements on self-serve kiosks, we have requirements for websites, and you're supposed to be requiring accessibility procurement, but there's been standards development committees that have made recommendations for changes to those regulations and those requirements. So we don't know where that's going yet, but there's certainly something you need to check and keep an eye on.
I think it's probably worth reiterating and sort of coming back to something we talked about at the last session in February. And if you reflect back on the example that we put up earlier from the Toronto parking pay and display meter, but really it applied to pretty much every technology system that we shared last time, which is, the legal requirements for the most part are your bare minimum. And in pretty much all of those cases, I would assume each of these systems that we showed met the minimum required and probably had language in the procurement around you shall meet AODA standards in the case of Ontario-based systems and whatnot. But yet we as a group and the audience participated in that, we're still able to find a lot of accessibility barriers that would present to different people. And so just recognizing that and for me, coming at it from as a transportation professional in the industry for 20 years and sort of working with ITS for 20 years, recognizing that just putting thou shalt meet AODA requirements in the specs is not enough. Obviously, you need to include that and you need to be aware of what those requirements are, but that's sort of where a lot of the growth and learning for me personally has been around understanding that piece, is that you need more than that, and sort of all of these other questions that Oscar and Kara are raising and working through these processes to include those as requirements.
Yeah, and I would say I often give clients the example or the analogy of how you think about privacy and security in technology procurements. You would never just have a one sentence, or at least I would presume you wouldn't have a one sentence in a procurement saying, thou shalt think about privacy, or or thou shalt comply with, and just name one specific piece of legislation. You would want to be thinking about that much more holistically, about how does this technology interact with other technology from the customer, the purchaser, but also how does that technology affect your privacy, your client's private, your passengers' privacy. Particularly when we're talking about credit card information, back to our purchasing, our ticketing examples, is that you're thinking about that and embedding it throughout the process. It's not something once you've launched a product that you're like, oh wait, we need to think about accessibility or privacy and security in this. So I just wanted to say about those legal requirements that there is right now a current requirement in Manitoba only specific to websites, but this is legislation of standards that is coming across the country. So BC currently has it, Nova Scotia has it. There's bills in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick legislatures. So it's coming across the country. Newfoundland recently passed legislation. So standards are going to be coming for the other places. But as you've all saying, really want to be thinking about user needs as really that key driver, not just about those legal requirements. And so who's going to be using the technology? Is it the public? Is it drivers? Is it operation centers? And so kind of back to our ticketing example, the pay and display for parking, you can assume that a driver has some sight and has reasonable sight to be able to engage as a driver. But we shouldn't assume that it's the driver necessarily that's paying for the parking. And certainly if we're talking about transit technology, that's even more so. Like, you definitely should not be assuming that every passenger has the ability to engage with something if it's only through sight. And then what are the other kind of requirements for that? So things that are for your if it's for an operator, clearly, a bus operator does need to have sight to be safely operating that vehicle. And so if there's technology that requires them to have sight on board, that's not an unreasonable requirement. It, is technically not going to meet some of those functional requirements that we were talking about previously, but it is aligned with the other kind of operational or functional requirements of their position. But they might be colorblind and be able to be a driver. And so there are other aspects where you might want to be thinking about color contrast, or not just using color to communicate information. And then, of course, what are the other business needs and how will that technology be used? So the difference between a mobile application, a website, a kiosk, all of these different things. I wanted to talk briefly about a resource that does exist, right? Or they're calling it a pilot resource, but it seems pretty robust to me at this point in time, which is a resource from the Government of Canada. It's a website that they have, and the link is here on the page. It's a long, complicated link, but you should be able to also find that by Googling. Around an ICT accessibility requirements wizard is what it's called. But you basically go in and say what your technology needs to be doing, or what does it provide, and it will give you both specifications that you could include in a procurement, as well as some sampling around how you would evaluate that. And so, I certainly suggest you need to look at this critically, what it gives you, but it will really give you some meaningful direction around what are those relevant accessibility requirements. Because what you need to be thinking about, just some of the examples on the screen, if we're talking about kind of fare cards versus two-way video communication, or kind of hardware with speech output, what you need to be thinking about from an accessibility perspective is going to differ for each of those different technologies, or what elements are included within that. And
Kara,
so
I shared the link in the global chat.
Great, thank you. And so this is based off of those EU standards. So we were talking about it's Canada building off of the EU standards, which are anticipated to be developed or to be adopted within Canada. And so it's specifically giving you some draft specifications and requirements around that. And then we get to the evaluating proposals stage of this, which I think Oscar will talk a bit more about.
Yeah, that's for sure. And as we've kind of talked about a bit, I mean, there's different terms for the voluntary product accessibility template, or the ACR. So the VPATs and ACRs are a useful way to kind of find out more about if you're procuring a product. Then you can basically hopefully get an impression of an awareness of the accessibility that already exists with it. We can move forward to the next slide here. It's good to kind of keep in mind that we've got, let's see, there's some things that you could, if you're receiving one of these documents, you kind of need to be able to do some quick evaluation of it. So, for example, is it recent? Is it current? Is it very clear what the actual evaluation considers? Because if it's considering all of our products are accessible, or if it's saying something blanket like this product is accessible, then you obviously need to ask for more information. So obviously the templates are designed to encourage people to document things in a specific way, but know that when you do receive something, you can't always consider everything to be truth. You have to sort of maybe sometimes do quick checks. If you're lucky and able to access a bit of the product, some part of the product, you can do some assessments yourself. And a lot of those assessments that you can do depend on understanding the kind of experiences that you're going to be building for. Again, looking back at the accessible user experiences or the functional accessibility requirements, and then knowing your product goals in that case as well. I'm wondering if you want to add anything here, Kara, before we move to the next slide.
Kara, you're on mute.
Thank you. The date of it is like either an indication that they haven't been pushing updates to their product, which is obviously a concern for other business issues, or they have pushed updates and they haven't updated their VPAT. Either
Right.
of which can be certainly a concern. And then making sure, I'd say sometimes if you're engaging with a vendor and you've asked them for a VPAT and they're like, what's that? Red flag. The fact that they don't even know what you're talking about is certainly an indication that they have not been meaningfully considering accessibility throughout that process, which is then going to be an indication. If you haven't, as we said it last time, it doesn't happen accidentally. And so if you haven't been thinking about accessibility throughout the development, it's not going to be an accessible product.
Yeah. And actually consider it from a different perspective as well. It's obviously if you're procuring someone else's product, but if you have a product that you are procured and you're trying to repurpose in a different space, you as an organizer are responsible for providing evidence of the accessibility of the product you've either procured or built. And that can often create a barrier for you. So if you are trying to resell a product in certain ways, or innovate in a larger space and share with your peers about the greatness you've done, if you understand the accessibility of your own product, you're promoting that kind of reuse and setting a bar that most other companies should try to lead to as well. So that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, and did you want to say anything about these other kind of red flags, Oscar? Or do you want me to just move forward?
Yeah, move forward. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of red flags, but I think it's okay to kind of look at this part now. And what we're looking at here is we're thinking about knowing that everything is going to have a gap. Not everything is going to be accessible. That's essentially not a possibility, because obviously humans are different and disabilities are different. So while it's important to try to do the best that you can, know that you should be at least able to identify the gaps in your product, and then either your product, or if a product is being presented to you, if the gaps are written down there, you want to see documentation showing the commitment to resolving those gaps. And this goes back to the whole idea of how old is this document. If it's 5 years old and they have committed to resolving things in the 2-year timeline, why haven't they done another reassessment to confirm that they fix those barriers? And then there's also the idea that while we can't make something fully accessible, I like the example that Carol gave earlier, where you're a driver, so obviously you have to have sight, but some of the products that are getting used might be used by somebody who doesn't have sight. What are the alternative options for somebody with that, or any barrier that can work around that problem? So while you can't necessarily have every piece of your product be fully accessible to the degree that might be recommended, if there's different ways of accommodating that barrier, then that's an important thing to be aware of as well. And then potentially you can strive towards, improving the product past that.
Yeah, and it was one of those red flags that we had suggested on the last slide around if somebody
That's
says
right.
that something supports everything, it's fully accessible. It might be true, but we would suggest adding a grain of salt to your interpretation and analysis of that
Yeah,
information to validate that it's actually as good as it sounds.
which is rare.
Yeah, and so then, and this is going to be really, I think, similar to anything else when you're doing kind of contract negotiations, just like you would for any of the other requirements and specifications, is being as specific and clear as you can in that contract negotiation so that you can have something to be holding that vendor to account to, and around clarity of responsibility to be addressing any issues. And so I'm saying this in relation to accessibility, but I'm sure if you've been involved in technology procurements more broadly, this is not specific to accessibility. It's true for any of those kind of business elements of your technology. So being as specific and clear as you can about what the accessibility standard is. So as you've always saying before, don't just say complies with the AODA, because honestly, the AODA has no applicability beyond websites. And so something could be completely inaccessible if it's technology. If it's not a website, it has complied with the AODA. That plus the fact that that's not a particularly high benchmark of accessibility. You're going to want to define the process for handling exceptions. As we've been saying, there will be some exceptions. And so what are acceptable exceptions, and what is the process to be defining those or to be accepting those? You're going to want to agree on deployment and support procedures, making sure that those include accessibility, not just the other kind of business elements of that. And you want to talk about what are you doing to test, deliver, validate that, and validate the accessibility. So again, very similar to what you'll be doing for other procurements and deployments. You also are going to really want to be thinking about what's the process for getting feedback about accessibility and about barriers and challenges. Because you're often going to find things down the road if you're looking for them and inviting that feedback. And so just what is the process for doing that? And whose responsibility is it, or when does the vendor's responsibility end to remediate any issues that are identified? So is that an ongoing obligation for them? Is this an ongoing relationship, or is this a purchase after which at some point in time down the road, the vendor's responsibility kind of wraps up and they're not going to be remedying any barriers that they identify down the road?
Tara, just before you move on, and I know we're sort of running up against the clock, I just wanted to take a moment to also reflect for the group, because there, a lot of how we framed this is if someone was working at an agency or an organization that's procuring, but I want to recognize that in the audience there might also be ITS vendors or companies that are in the software development space, and that a lot of the lessons and sort of takeaways that we're talking about here equally apply, right? And that you as a software vendor, it's a lot easier and quite honestly probably a good from a business perspective to be thinking about, again, accessibility as early as you can in a product lifecycle, and sort of building that into your roadmap by again, engaging users or potential users of the system that might have accessibility needs into the defining of the requirements, into the defining of the specifications that you're developing your software around, not necessarily waiting for an agency or organization that's procuring something to then drive your development and sort of trying to patch something on after the fact. And so a lot of the lessons that we've talked about here and a lot of the learnings are equally applicable to vendors and organizations that are in the software development space. You're on mute.
Yeah, I know. The requirements wizard that I was talking about a moment ago, you could equally be using that to define your internal requirements for your development team of saying these are the elements, just like you would define business requirements. You could also be defining accessibility requirements as part of that process. So that gets us to the last step, which is implementing. And so the testing of this is partially relevant to the procurement and partially relevant to the implementation. So we're going to talk about it a bit here.
Yeah. And this can be when you're evaluating a product that you're receiving, or obviously when you're creating that product. And the things that we're talking about here is like, we did go through those accessibility user experiences a little bit and how they associate to functional accessibility requirements. which can lead to the success criteria that you define for your product specifically. But the idea here is there's a few simple things that you can do. Just if it's a digital product that's like on a website, the quick checks might include just running automated testing. If you're able to use a tool on the product to evaluate it, do that. And if it starts flagging a bunch of accessibility errors, not all automated flags are wrong or are actually barriers, but often they are. So if you're able to do a quick check to see, well, you've missed some pretty obvious things in your website, I will evaluate before I even deal with a vendor. I'll just go to their homepage, and if they're not, if they've got mistakes there that they shouldn't have, because they're really obvious, like beginner level problems, then, like for example, it's not working with a keyboard, then I don't know that I want to engage with them beyond that to procure an accessible product. So while your product might be accessible, maybe consider your website as being accessible as well. So a lot of these things are really good to do. You can do quick checks with like keyboard testing, use the automation, but more importantly than just like these types of things, testing color contrast or using these tools, remember those, the FARs and the AUX. Remember the customers that you're building for, the people that you're creating the products for, and have at least a bit of an understanding of how they're going to use the product. And in that way, you can kind of evaluate the accessibility that way, as well as some testing methods.
I think that's a really great tip for the vendors on the call, Oscar, of like not just the product that you're selling, but also your website. Because I would definitely treat somebody with skepticism if you can't make your website accessible, or can you actually make your product accessible? And so making sure that it's an accessible product or accessible website, just to demonstrate that you've got it.
Yeah. And on this slide, we have kind of an extension of that concept and idea of understanding your users. And, it's great to have, people to test with. So if you're able to test your products with people with disabilities or people in general, that's the best way to get feedback. If you're able to do that before you implement it and go live, do that. And even after you go live, you can do that as well. But if you think about the idea of personas, which is in this page, we've described that Tracy is 28 years old and lives with her family. They're on the spectrum. And if we look at the last bullet there, they're like a power keyboard user. So people with disabilities who can't use a mouse, so people who might have arthritis, for example, they will rely on using a keyboard or a similar technology. But it doesn't mean that you need to explicitly write that you've got a person with arthritis into your persona or your user case. But you can still identify that experience of somebody using a keyboard as part of that. So if you can't test with real people, you can kind of define a series of different personalities or personas that align with those accessible user experiences and the functional accessibility requirements, which so you already have that understanding of what barriers may be present and what challenges might be there. And you've got it written down in a form that actually humanizes that as well, rather than just treating it as a checklist.
Yeah, and here we've given a link to a government website that's got it's the same resources, but here they've got, I don't know, maybe 15 different personas that you can be using to think through that testing. And it's specifically designed for technology and digital accessibility, and so it's just a useful resource. Yuval, can you plop that into the chat as well?
Already shared.
Great, thank you.
Fantastic. All right, so now we're going to talk about when you have a product that's live, and we kind of already touched on the idea of asking for user feedback before. But even when your product is out there, ask right away. Don't wait for someone to tell you something's great. Or don't wait for someone to tell you something's broken. Ask them, and whether you get positive feedback or negative feedback, you can still share that. If it's positive, like if someone tells you, I really had a great experience using that product, obviously you're going to tell people that. But if someone also identifies that there is a barrier with your product, it goes back to that planning stage, because nothing really ends, right? You always have to kind of go back and keep working on it and learn from those things. And if you can identify those barriers which is one of the things, which is the purpose of a voluntary product accessibility template. It identifies those barriers. Write that down and know that, okay, if there's going to be either a product that will replace this or a future iteration on the product, you have that written down and saying, we know that we didn't quite do the best we could here, but we can make it better. So that's making the plan and committing to improving the product over time. And the reason here that you could even share that publicly even is that you're proving to people that you do take accessibility seriously. And I know that there's always the risk of litigation and human rights complaints. So never mind what the government's telling us to do. If there's a human rights complaint against you, that goes above and beyond even the Accessibility Canada Act. But if you've got a plan to fix and you've got documented evidence that you're hoping to make a better product, that goes a long way in litigation, and it kind of, again, mitigates that risk to your product and to your brand. So keep those things in mind. Celebrate good things and maybe be honest about some of the things that you know you can do better.
All right, so now what? And this is sort of the concluding remarks, and we wanted to frame this, or I wanted to frame this as sort of someone. I lost my. Oh, there we go. As someone who's sort of like the audience, is from originally the transportation space, transportation ITS. I've been in doing transit ITS in specific since the early 2000s, but accessibility has become more. I've become more aware of the disability and accessibility requirements of these systems as my career has evolved, and in particular of the last 7 or 8 years. So first and foremost, recognizing that accessibility is really something that you should be thinking about across the product lifecycle, across your system lifecycle, and building it into your organization's processes. I think that we tried to harp on that from the beginning, and we sort of conveyed sort of why that is, or how that plays out. I think for me personally, a takeaway has been, and I sort of mentioned it sort of earlier on in the session, is that the earlier you can bring this into your systems and into your organization, the more cost effective and the easier the business case is. And really for organizations in the public sector that do procurements, what that means is defining and then validating and then building into your contract robust and rigorous accessibility criteria in your procurements. Obviously for the organizations on the vendor side, it's about capturing and trying to do as much as you can and building in accessibility into your system through the ways we talked about, even before the point of procurement, right? As you're building your systems, as you're creating your product roadmaps, building that into there. Underlying all of this really is engagement with users, and when we say users, we mean users with disabilities and varied disabilities. You might have a software developer in your staff, or maybe someone in your organization that has a disability, and that's great, and obviously their perspective is important, but as we touched on last time, different disabilities have different impacts and can create different barriers, and so you need to have that variety and that breadth of perspective when you're considering how to approach your technology systems. And one of the things underlying that is the importance of change management. So all of this is really contingent around advancing your organizational maturity, as Oscar laid out. And to do that, it's really around building accessibility into the fabric, into the social fabric of your organization, making sure that that's sort of a key consideration when making decisions throughout at each juncture of your product and system. A couple more thoughts that really came to mind. I mean, we shared with you a couple useful tools. I think it's good to know that there are a lot of tools and standards out there south of the border in particular, and the EU, Kara mentioned as well, and use those. But then ultimately, there's also expertise out there. Obviously, we are available, but there are other experts in the industry that are available to help. Many of your organizations have experts. And in particular, what I would say is for you public organizations that have accessibility committees or groups, use those groups, use that expertise. Really, it's by engaging with individuals with disabilities, understanding what their needs are. That is the way that we are going to make systems and put into place systems that are the most accessible. So maybe with that, I will end. I'll thank everyone for participating in our two-part webinar series. Both of these have been recorded. Yannicka, maybe I'll hand it back to you, I believe, for closing remarks and
Or Omar.
or Omar, is it? Okay. But thank you, everyone, for your time.
I'll leave it to you, Judy.
Great job, guys. I really enjoyed that. I love the banter. I love lots of good information shared with us. Thank you so much for making time to present to us. And I hope that those of you in the audience, I did not see any questions come through the question panel, but should you have some later on? Oh, you do have one, Yannicka?
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah, it says, is there a VPAT template for use in the Canadian context that you would recommend?
So the VPAT template exists. It's developed centrally, so that there's one central organization that it's developed. There's several different VPAT, different templates based off of you needing to define whether you want that based off of kind of the Section 508 requirements or the EU requirements. So I would suggest using the VPAT based off of the EU requirements, but you could honestly, there's also one that's kind of a harmonized version of the VPAT for both of them. And that's kind of the standard template or form that any vendor would then be completing to give testing and completing to give information to their customers about the accessibility of their product.
And those templates, are they available on a website, or is that something that the particular person who posed the question can get through you?
So I think there's two questions. One is about where the uncompleted template, those you can find online as the uncompleted template. The completed templates, it's any individual vendor you would have to get. Some vendors put them up on their website as completed ones. So for example, Microsoft has hundreds of them up on their website for every specific product, every specific version of the product. So there might be like 20 of them specific to Microsoft Teams, for example. I found some of them in this space. So I was able to find, for example, Ecolanes, I found on their website. Clever Devices, I was not able to find on their website. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. They just have not made the decision to post it on their website. So you'd have to ask the particular vendor for a completed VPAT.
Yeah, and just I posted, there's a link off of the 508.gov or section 508.gov where they have the VPAT and you can download the current, it says download the current VPAT template.
And just to reiterate what Kara had mentioned earlier, so in Canada, it's not yet a requirement. We are promoting it as a best practice. And the reason there's a 508 template is because in the US, organizations doing business with the federal government must provide it. So that's why, especially for Canadian agencies, it's useful to know that, hey, a lot of times the vendors that we're purchasing from are working south of the border. If they've done business in the US with the federal government, they have done, these organizations, these vendors would have had to produce these templates.
Yeah. And I've had City of Toronto tell us when we're providing a product for City of Toronto, the city has asked for VPATs. So while it is specifically, to the United States, agencies here are asking for it. Government Ontario did a very similar kind of ask. It wasn't a VPAT specifically, but it is something that we should be doing and be aware of.
Thank you. And I think that that was the question that was asked. So I reflect on today's webinar. There's a lot of detail that you presented, a lot of information. And so I'm glad it's being recorded just so that I can take a look back and take my time and re-listen to everything that was discussed today. I very much liked the format of the back and forth today. That sort of switches it up and keeps the attention and listening. I will take both recordings and put them on the ITS Canada YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel with permission of Cara, Yuval, and Oscar, if that's okay. And
Yeah.
then once I have it booked, put on the ITS Canada our YouTube channel, I will send everybody who is registered for the webinar. I'll put that. I'll send it in an email once that link is available. So I guess thanks everybody. This was very, very insightful. And like I said before, lots of information to digest, lots of details to digest, and also truly understand sort of what the meaning is of what we've learned and what we've listened to. And with that, one little thing. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Judy, for having brought the idea to our attention of hosting the 2 series webinar. Thank you very much. And I hope to see everybody in Windsor at the upcoming ITS Canada Annual Conference, June 14th to June 16th. And last, wish everybody a happy, happy Easter if that is what you're celebrating.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Annika.
Yes, happy Passover, happy Ramadan, happy all of the holidays that are aligning right now.
Yeah.
Happy spring. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.